It is the year 79 AD. The Roman governor of Britain, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, is pushing the conquest of the island steadily northward into what is now the north of England. His legions need a chain of forts to control the road network linking the great fortress towns of Diva, modern Chester, and Eboracum, modern York. Roman surveyors scout the land and settle on a low sandstone bluff above the point where two rivers meet, the Medlock and the Irwell. It is a good defensive position, raised above the floodplain with water on two sides.
The local people, a branch of the Brigantes tribe who control much of northern Britain, already have a name for this place, something that means roughly breast-shaped hill, a reference to the curve of the bluff itself. Roman tongues twist this into Latin as Mamucium. The fort that rises here is not glamorous. It is built to hold around 500 auxiliary soldiers, not Roman citizens from Italy, but auxiliaries recruited from across the empire's frontiers. Men from what is now Spain, from the Rhineland in Germany, from the Roman provinces of North Africa. For them, this is about as far from home as it is possible to be posted. The climate is cold, wet, and gray, a world away from the Mediterranean sun most of them grew up under.
They build first in timber and earth, a rectangular fort with earthen ramparts topped by a wooden palisade, ditches dug around the perimeter, a grid of barracks, granaries, and a headquarters building inside. Decades later, the fort is rebuilt in stone, a sign that Rome intends to stay. Outside the fort's gates, as happens at every Roman garrison in Britain, a civilian settlement grows up, what the Romans call a vicus. Traders set up stalls, craftspeople, blacksmiths, leather workers, potters, open workshops. The wives and children of soldiers, along with local Britons drawn by the prospect of trade, settle here. At its peak, the vicus probably holds no more than a few hundred people. There is a bathhouse where soldiers off duty can socialize and clean themselves of the frontier mud. There was a mansio, a kind of official Roman inn where traveling messengers and officials can rest and change horses. Grain is ground in mills. Pottery kilns fire bowls and storage jars. It is not a great city. It is a small, hard-working outpost at the very edge of the known world, but it is part of an empire that stretches from Scotland to the Sahara.
Inside the fort itself, daily life follows the same rhythm it follows at hundreds of similar outposts scattered across the Roman frontier. Soldiers drill in the central yard. Officers review supply manifests delivered along the road from Chester. Blacksmiths in the fort's workshops repair armor and weapons worn down by the damp local climate, which rusts iron far faster than the dry air of the Mediterranean ever did. Granaries, raised on stone footings to keep out damp and vermin, store the grain that keeps the garrison fed through the long, wet northern winters. A small shrine inside the fort allows soldiers to make offerings to the gods of Rome alongside local deities they've picked up from the Brigantes, a quiet, everyday kind of cultural blending that happens at frontier posts all across the empire.
Inside the fort itself, daily life follows the same rhythm it follows at hundreds of similar outposts scattered across the Roman frontier. Soldiers drill in the central yard. Officers review supply manifests delivered along the road from Chester. Blacksmiths in the fort's workshops repair armor and weapons worn down by the damp local climate, which rusts iron far faster than the dry air of the Mediterranean ever did. Granaries, raised on stone footings to keep out damp and vermin, store the grain that keeps the garrison fed through the long, wet northern winters. A small shrine inside the fort allows soldiers to make offerings to the gods of Rome, alongside local deities they've picked up from the Brigantes. A quiet, everyday kind of cultural blending that happens at frontier posts all across the empire.
Beyond the ramparts, the vicus hums with a different kind of energy. Local Britons arrive to trade wool, leather, and livestock for Roman coin and Roman goods, fine pottery, glassware, wine amphorae shipped up from southern ports. Roman administrators record births, deaths, and property transactions on wax tablets, a handful of which survive in the archaeological record today, offering rare glimpses of named individuals who actually lived and worked here 2,000 years ago. Children of soldiers and local women grow up speaking a mixture of Latin and the Brigantian dialect, belonging fully to neither Roman nor British culture, but to something new, forged at the edge of empire.
Beyond the ramparts, the Vicus hums with a different kind of energy. Local Britons arrive to trade wool, leather, and livestock for Roman coin and Roman goods. Fine pottery, glassware, wine amphorae shipped up from southern ports. Roman administrators record births, deaths, and property transactions on wax tablets, a handful of which survive in the archaeological record today, offering rare glimpses of named individuals who actually lived and worked here 2,000 years ago. Children of soldiers and local women grow up speaking a mixture of Latin and the Brigantian dialect, belonging fully to neither Roman nor British culture, but to something new, forged at the edge of empire. For roughly 3 centuries, Mamucium endures. Soldiers rotate through. The Vicus grows, shrinks, rebuilds. Then, in 410 AD, Rome's hold on Britain collapses. The legions are recalled to defend a crumbling empire on the continent, and the official machinery of Roman government in Britain simply stops. Within a generation, the stone buildings of Mamucium are being quarried by local people for building material elsewhere. The roads crack and fill with weeds. The civilian settlement is largely abandoned. The Romans leave behind foundations, scattered coins, broken pottery, and a place name, but little else. Mamucium fades into obscurity, and for the next 600 years, Manchester all but disappears from history. We know almost nothing for certain about Manchester in the centuries between the Roman withdrawal and the Norman conquest of 1066. The name itself drifts and changes with the language spoken by the people who live here. Mamucium becomes, in Old English, something like Mamachester, the Roman fort by the breast-shaped hill, which slowly contracts over the centuries into Manchester. There is probably a small Anglo-Saxon settlement here, perhaps a wooden church, but no detailed records survive from this period. It is one of the great blank spaces in English urban history. When the Domesday Book is compiled in 1086 on the orders of William the Conqueror, Manchester barely gets a mention. It is recorded as part of the manor of Salford, with a population that may number only a few hundred. It is nothing special, just one more cluster of timber buildings among thousands scattered across the conquered kingdom. But slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, Manchester begins to grow. In 1222, the lord of the manor secures a royal charter permitting a market to be held. This single administrative event matters more than it sounds. A market means regular trade. Trade means money changing hands, and money changing hands means a settlement starts to thicken, to attract blacksmiths and innkeepers and wool merchants who want to be near the action. The town expands outward from the market cross. A parish church, dedicated to St. Mary, later to become Manchester Cathedral, is built on a site that likely held earlier Saxon churches before it. By the 1300s, it is being rebuilt in the soaring, perpendicular Gothic style fashionable across England. Even so, the town remains tiny by any standard we would recognize. By around 1400, perhaps 1,500 people live in Manchester. It is surrounded by marshland, the rivers flood with depressing regularity. The streets are mud for half the year. It is agricultural, unpolished, and entirely unremarkable next to grander English towns like York or Bristol. Around the market cross, a recognizable medieval townscape slowly takes shape. Timber-framed houses with overhanging upper floors lean toward each other across narrow lanes, their ground floors given over to workshops and stalls. On market days, farmers drive sheep and cattle in from the surrounding villages, while weavers and dyers lay out bolts of rough woolen cloth for inspection. Pigs root through refuse in the side streets. The parish church bell marks the hours and calls the town to worship, the one fixed rhythm in an otherwise unpredictable agricultural calendar governed by harvests, floods, and the occasional outbreak of plague or fever that periodically empties whole streets. A handful of merchant families begin to accumulate modest wealth from the wool and cloth trade, building slightly grander timber houses that still, centuries later, occasionally turn up hidden behind later brick facades when old buildings are renovated. What Manchester does have, though, is wool. The Lancashire countryside around it produces wool in abundance, and Manchester becomes a modest regional center for wool trading and cloth making. Small-scale work, much of it done inside homes and workshops rather than anything resembling a factory. It is something, even if it is not yet much. In the 1530s, Henry VIII dissolves England's monasteries, seizing their wealth and land in one of the most disruptive religious and economic events in English history. Manchester, never a heavily monastic town to begin with, survives this upheaval, relatively unscathed. In 1421, the parish church had already become a collegiate church, run by a college of resident priests rather than monks, and this institution simply endures through the Reformation, more or less intact. A century later, England tears itself apart in civil war. Manchester, unusually for the northwest of England, sides firmly with Parliament against King Charles I. In 1642, Royalist forces lay siege to the town. The defenders, mostly local militia armed with
Whatever weapons they can find, somehow managed to hold the line. The episode earns Manchester a lasting reputation as a parliamentarian stronghold in a region that otherwise leans royalist. By 1650, the population has grown to perhaps 5,000. It is becoming a proper town in its own right, helped along by a grammar school founded in 1515, a modest accumulation of wealth from the textile trade, and a growing reputation as a regional commercial hub. But it is still not special. Not yet. That is about to change in a way nobody in 17th century Manchester could possibly have predicted. Everything changes in the 1700s, and it changes because of a single imported fabric: cotton. In the late 1600s, cotton cloth from India becomes fashionable across England. It is lighter than wool, easier to wash, and takes dye more vividly. There's just one problem. Britain does not grow cotton. Every fiber has to be imported as raw material and then spun and woven into finished cloth domestically. And here is the point at which Manchester's story becomes permanently and inseparably entangled with the history of slavery. The raw cotton flowing into Britain's ports comes overwhelmingly from plantations in the American South and the Caribbean, worked by enslaved Africans under brutal conditions. The mechanism that brings this cotton to England is what historians call the triangular trade. British ships leave ports like Liverpool and Bristol loaded with manufactured goods, sail to the West African coast and trade those goods for captured human beings, then carry those enslaved people across the Atlantic, packed into the holds of slave ships under horrific conditions, before finally returning to Britain loaded with raw cotton, sugar, and tobacco bought with the profits of human bondage. Manchester does not run the ships or the auctions, but it sits at the economic heart of this system, as the place where the raw material gets turned into profit. Lancashire's damp climate, it turns out, is almost perfectly suited to working cotton fiber without it snapping, and so the region becomes the natural center of Britain's cotton manufacturing industry. At first, production is entirely a cottage industry. Spinners work at home with simple spinning wheels, turning raw cotton into thread. Weavers operate hand looms in their own cottages, turning thread into cloth. Merchants travel from cottage to cottage, collecting the finished fabric and selling it on. Sometimes, with grim irony, selling it back to plantation owners to clothe the very people they enslave. Then, within the space of about 15 years, everything about how cloth is made is reinvented. In 1764, James Hargreaves invents the spinning jenny, a frame that allows one worker to spin several threads simultaneously, rather than just one. In 1769, Richard Arkwright patents the water frame, a spinning machine powerful enough that it needs to be driven by a water wheel rather than human hands. In 1779, Samuel Crompton combines elements of both machines into the spinning mule,
producing threads strong and fine enough for almost any fabric. Suddenly, a single worker operating one of these machines can do the work that used to require dozens of spinners. These new machines are simply too large, too expensive, and too power-hungry to fit inside a cottage. They need dedicated buildings. They need a reliable source of mechanical power, first water wheels, and before long, steam engines. And so, the factory, as a concept, is born almost by necessity. The first cotton mills rise in Manchester and the towns around it through the 1780s and 1790s. Multi-story brick buildings packed with whirring machinery driven by steam, employing hundreds of workers under a single roof for the first time in human history. By 1800, Manchester is no longer a market town that happens to make some cloth. It is becoming something the world has genuinely never seen before, an industrial city built from scratch around the factory system. Cotton
Is king. The mills are multiplying month by month, and the population is surging as people pour in from the surrounding countryside looking for work. The stage is set. The 19th century is about to deliver Manchester's greatest triumphs and some of its darkest chapters. The transformation is visible everywhere you look by the turn of the century. Tall brick chimneys rise above the rooftops of what was, only a generation earlier, a modest market town, each one pouring a steady column of coal smoke into the Lancashire sky. Canals are dug to carry coal into the city and finished cloth back out. The Bridgewater Canal, opened in 1761, becomes one of the first true triumphs of British civil engineering, slashing the cost of moving coal and goods compared to overland cart transport. Engineers and entrepreneurs flood into the region, drawn by the promise of fortune, while millwrights and machine builders set up workshops to service the rapidly multiplying factories. Richard Arkwright himself opens one of the first true cotton mills nearby at Cromford, and his model spreads rapidly across Lancashire, copied by ambitious local businessmen eager to claim a share of the new wealth.
The 19th century opens with Manchester already transformed into something unprecedented. In 1801, its population stands at around 70,000 people. Cotton mills now dominate the skyline. Steam engines fill the air with a constant haze of smoke. This is the future of the world, and it is being invented, quite literally, in Manchester's streets. But the human cost of this transformation is staggering. Workers are crammed into back-to-back terraced houses built around narrow, airless courtyards, with whole families sharing a single room. There is no sanitation worth the name, and little access to clean water. Disease spreads with terrible ease through these conditions. The mills themselves operate 12, 14, even 16 hours a day. Children as young as 5 or 6 are put to work inside them, their small hands and bodies considered useful for crawling beneath running machinery to clear away loose cotton fiber, an extraordinarily dangerous job. Industrial accidents are routine.
Workers' lungs fill over years with cotton dust, a condition that comes to be known as cotton lung. By the 1840s, average life expectancy in industrial Manchester has fallen to around 25 years, a figure that reflects appalling infant and child mortality as much as anything else, but a brutal statistic regardless. And yet, people keep arriving anyway, because the alternative is worse. The surrounding countryside offers little or no paid work. In Manchester, however, meager and dangerous, there are wages. Irish immigrants flood into the city in huge numbers, especially after the devastating potato famine of the 1840s drives hundreds of thousands of people off the land entirely. The city sprawls outward in every direction, chaotic, unplanned, and largely indifferent to the welfare of the people crowding into it.
And yet the wealth being generated here is genuinely extraordinary. By the 1830s, Manchester and the towns surrounding it are producing the majority of the world's cotton goods. People start calling the city Cottonopolis. The irony embedded in that nickname is brutal. Some of the poorest, most overworked people in England are processing cotton picked by enslaved people in America.
and neither group sees much of the wealth that their labor creates. The mill owners, the merchants, the middlemen, they are the ones growing rich. Everyone else is simply struggling to survive. And a growing number of Manchester's workers are starting to ask an obvious question. If this city generates so much of the nation's wealth, why does it have no real political voice? Foreign visitors who travel to Manchester
in these decades come away stunned, in equal measure, by its wealth and its misery. French and German observers describe entire districts where the sun never seems to fully break through the haze of coal smoke, where row after row of mills run day and night, their windows glowing orange from gas lighting long after dark, the throbbing rhythm of steam engines audible blocks away. Warehouses, several stories tall,
Built specifically to store and display bolts of cotton cloth for merchants and buyers, rise along streets like Portland Street and Mosley Street, palatial on the outside, while a few streets away, families live 12 to a room in cellar dwellings below street level, often flooded with sewage whenever the rivers rise. This is the contradiction that defines Cottonopolis. More wealth concentrated in one place than almost anywhere else on the planet, and more visible human suffering than almost anywhere else in England. By 1819, frustration over exactly this question reaches breaking point. Manchester is, by now, one of the largest cities in England, yet it sends no members of Parliament to Westminster. Most working people across the country have no vote at all, no say in the laws and taxes that govern their daily lives. On the 16th of August, 1819, a vast crowd gathers at St. Peter's Field on the edge of the city center. Somewhere between 60 and 80,000 people, men, women, and children, converge peacefully to hear the radical orator Henry Hunt speak in favor of parliamentary reform. Families come dressed in their Sunday best.
People bring picnic baskets. Banners overhead call for liberty and fair representation. It is, by every contemporary account, a peaceful, almost festive gathering. The local magistrates, watching from nearby buildings, panic at the sheer size of the crowd. They order Hunt's arrest. To force their way through the packed field, they send in the local yeomanry, a part-time volunteer cavalry force, many of whom are reportedly drunk, armed with sabers. What follows is a massacre. The yeomanry charge directly into the densely packed crowd, slashing indiscriminately with their swords at anyone in their path. People scream, scramble to escape, and trip over one another in the crush. Regular cavalry, the professional soldiers of the 15th Hussars, are then sent in as well, and the panic and bloodshed intensify. By the time it is over, around 15 people are dead, and several hundred more are injured, many of them with terrible saber wounds. Saber wounds. Henry Hunt and the other organizers are arrested and later imprisoned. But the event itself earns a name that will outlive every official report written about it. Peterloo. A bitter, deliberate mockery of the recent British military triumph at Waterloo. This was not a glorious victory. This was the British state turning armed force against its own unarmed citizens for the crime of demanding a basic political voice. News of the massacre spreads across the country within days, carried by newspapers that print eyewitness accounts of women and children cut down in the crush. The radical press seizes on the events at St. Peter's Field as proof of everything wrong with a political system that answers peaceful protest with cavalry sabers. The poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, on hearing the news, writes a furious response, calling on the people of England to rise up like lions after slumber. The government of the day, rather than investigating the magistrates' conduct, instead passes a series of repressive laws known as the Six Acts, designed to clamp down further on public assembly and radical publishing, a heavy-handed response that only deepens public anger in the years that follow. Peterloo does not win parliamentary reform overnight, but it plants a seed that will not stop growing. The memory of that single bloody afternoon on St. Peter's Field galvanizes the reform movement for an entire generation, and Manchester's working people will, in time, gain a measure of political power to match the economic importance their labor has already given the city.
11 years after Peterloo, Manchester makes history again, but this time through innovation rather than violence. On the 15th of September, 1830, an enormous crowd gathers along Liverpool Road to witness the opening of the world's first intercity passenger railway. George Stephenson's locomotive, the Rocket, is about to pull carriages between Liverpool and Manchester at a previously unimaginable speed of around 30 miles per hour. A journey that once took a full day by canal barge will now take less than 2 hours by rail. The day is meant to be a triumph, and in most respects it is, but it is also marked by tragedy. William Huskisson, a member of Parliament, steps down from his carriage during a stop to greet the Duke of Wellington and wanders, distracted, onto an adjacent track. The Rocket strikes him, and he dies that evening of his injuries. History's first recorded railway passenger fatality.
Despite this grim beginning, the railway changes absolutely everything about how Manchester's industry functions. Within a decade, rail lines radiate outward from the city in every direction. Raw cotton arrives faster than ever before. Finished cloth departs for markets scattered across the entire globe. The industrial system that already made Manchester rich becomes even more efficient, even more profitable, even more dominant. Manchester is no longer just connected to Lancashire and Liverpool. It is connecting, link by link, to the wider world. The success of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway triggers a frenzy of railway building across the entire country over the following 2 decades, a period historians later call railway mania. Manchester ends up at the center of a dense web of competing lines, and the grand Victorian railway stations built to serve them,
Victoria, Piccadilly, Central, become some of the most architecturally ambitious buildings in the city. Their soaring iron and glass roofs echoing the scale of the cotton warehouses springing up nearby. Locomotive works and engineering firms cluster around the rail yards, turning Manchester into not just a consumer of new transport technology, but a manufacturer of it, building railway equipment that gets exported to clients as far away as India, Argentina, and Australia. Through the 1830s and 1840s, the movement against slavery is gathering real strength across Britain. More and more people are confronting the moral horror of a trade that has, until recently, been treated as simply another branch of commerce. Britain abolishes the transatlantic slave trade itself in 1807, and then abolishes slavery throughout its own colonies in 1833.
But Manchester remains deeply conflicted because the raw cotton still has to come from somewhere, and American slavery continues uninterrupted. Many Manchester mill owners would simply rather not discuss where their primary raw material originates. It is uncomfortable. It is, quite frankly, bad for business to dwell on it. And yet many ordinary Manchester workers see the underlying connection clearly enough. They are exploited by mill owners. Enslaved people across the Atlantic are exploited by plantation owners. It is, in their eyes, fundamentally the same system of exploitation, differing only in its degree of brutality. In 1842, a young German man named Friedrich Engels arrives in Manchester to work in his father's cotton trading business. He is 22 years old, well-educated, and from a comfortable, wealthy family. And nothing in his upbringing has prepared him for what he encounters in Manchester streets. Engels walks through the city slums and documents what he sees in painstaking, furious detail. Cellar dwellings where entire families live in permanent darkness and damp. Open sewers running through residential streets. Children visibly suffering from rickets. Workers coughing blood from years of inhaling cotton dust. He observes the mills themselves, the relentless machinery, the 14-hour shifts,
the casual cruelty with which workers are treated as simply another input to be used up. In 1845, he publishes The Condition of the Working Class in England, a devastating, closely observed expose of industrial capitalism at its harshest. Around this time, Engels meets Karl Marx, and the two men become lifelong collaborators. Together, in 1848, they write the Communist Manifesto. Years later, profits from Engels' family cotton mill business will help quietly fund Marx's ongoing research for Das Kapital. Manchester, the city that built the modern factory, also ends up directly funding one of the most influential critiques of factory capitalism ever written.